Well, greetings, everybody. Welcome to another exciting lecture. Our topic for today is when China rules the world. Well, as you know, the United States has pretty well dominated the world politics since the end of World War II, when it was only the United States and to a less extent the Soviet Union, who basically divided the world up between them. So we had two great global empires. Well, as we look into the future, or even at the present, we see that Russia has declined as a major world power. The United States is sort of troubled politically. But the country that is really taking over the future is China. And so the title here is When China Rules the World. It's not when will China rule the world or will China rule the world. It's pretty well evident that China is the up and coming world power. So get used to it. Well, you can see the picture on the right. That's me coming down from the Temple of Heaven in Beijing on one of my trips around the world. And I spent a lovely vacation in Beijing and Shanghai and Xi'an and other places. So I have a little bit of personal experience with China, and I am convinced that China is the up and coming world power. So this is our outline for today. The Confucian background of Chinese identity. Confucius, the great philosopher and teacher, established Confucianism, which many people call a religion. And this has strongly shaped the Chinese mentality. Point two is how the Chinese view recent history. Point three is the reemergence of China after several centuries of decline. Point four is its rise to world domination, the largest economic power. Its navy is larger than the United States. Its army is larger than the United States. And pretty soon it will be the number one power with the United States as number two. And finally, fifth part, what kind of superpower is China going to be? Think of how the United States acted when it ruled the world. Terrible wars in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. But then on the other hand, very positive rebuilding of Germany, Italy, Japan after the Second World War. So sort of a mixed bag of history. Will China prove to be a benign world power? Will it become more aggressive and try to take over the whole world? Well, we shall see. Excuse me. So, once again, there's Dr. Ronald Brown. Let's get started on our visit to the empire of the future, China. So, it's inevitable. As I said, many books are being written on the rise of China. My favorite is Martin Jacques' When China Rules the World, the rise of the Middle Kingdom, and the end of the Western world. Well, I don't know if Donald Trump and Joseph Biden and the Europeans agree that it's the end of the Western world, but Martin Jacques argues that it is. Other books such as China Threat. Is China a real threat? And a threat to what? China rising and its postmodern fate. What kind of empire is China going to produce? Well, let's step back in time, figure out what is China all about, what really motivates it. You can't understand China without understanding its great philosopher Confucius, who lived from 551 to 478 BC, or before the Common Era. Now, Confucius was not a god. He was not a prophet receiving messages from God. He was not the son of God. He was a teacher. In fact, he was a history professor, teaching history, political science, stuff like that, just like me. And when you see him carrying his books, and his hat shows that he is a professor, not a king, not a god, not a prophet, not a rabbi or a priest. He was a teacher. Well, in Confucianism, there is no God floating around on a cloud up in heaven who talks to people and sends earthquakes and all this kind of stuff. For Confucius, don't worry about heaven. There's no heaven. There's no hell. In fact, this life is all you get. So for Confucius, if there is a God, the God is China, making China great and prosperous. And if the Confucianists use the word heaven, they're not talking about a place where you go when you die, up on the clouds, where you can have all the free pizza and Budweiser beer that you can possibly want. For Confucius, heaven is here on earth. So it is the duty of Confucianists to build a prosperous, stable, peaceful world here and now. This is the basic belief of Confucianism. So don't pray to a God and ask a God to come and help you. Don't wait for happiness after you're dead. Find happiness here on this earth. So that is the basic fundamental teaching of Confucianism. That's why Chinese students are so good as students, because they realize that if they don't get a good education, and if they're not prosperous and successful in this world, they'll go down as a failure. There's no God up in heaven waiting to make up for all the terrible things on this earth. Christians and Jews teach that there's a heaven where you go when you die. So if you have a terrible life here and now, well, don't worry, because you'll get a better life when you're dead. Well, a Confucian would say, if your life here is miserable, get off your ass and do something about it, because this is all you get. Well, as you visit China, you're constantly seeing words which we use in English referring to heaven, such as the gate of heavenly peace, with a painting of Mao Zedong going and over the bridge and into the forbidden city. Well, when they say heavenly peace, heaven, as I said, is not up in the sky when you're dead. You are to build heaven here on earth, the hall of supreme harmony. Such lofty words for the temples and the gates and the palaces of China. But these lofty words are not associated with a God or heaven or hell. They're associated with the earthly order. That's what you're supposed to build here on earth. The Confucian view of human society is heaven is at the top. Once again, heaven is here on earth. And it is the duty of the emperor, or today the prime minister or the president, to build and to guide all of society. So it's a very hierarchical society, with heaven and emperor at the top, and the emperor organizes a government to carry out his wishes. The states and the regions have their jobs of organizing education and building bridges and highways. The clan, that's the extended family, all your relatives, and not just the living relatives, but the relatives who have lived in the past, the ancestors. You have a duty to your ancestors. If you commit a crime, you are shaming not just you, but you are shaming all of society, and especially your family name. Well, almost at the bottom comes the individual. Individual, me, is at the very bottom. The individual's duty is to society, to his family, to his clan, to the region, to the state, to the government, to the emperor, and the vision of heaven on earth. Now, this is the exact opposite of what we have in the West. In the West, it is the individual is at the top. In the United States, if you want a gun, you go out and anybody can get a gun. We kill people very easily and freely in the United States because it's everybody's right to have a gun. Whereas in China, your individual rights are very limited because you are working for a greater society. And at the bottom are the ancestors. Everybody in China knows their ancestors, their homes, have a little shrine honoring their ancestors. One of the most important holidays in the Chinese Confucian calendar is the tomb sweeping day. When you go back to your hometown, even if it's 1,000 miles away, and you spruce up the tombs of your ancestors, because you are a descendant of them. They accomplished what they did in society, and it is your duty to live up to the accomplishments of your ancestors. And it's your duty also to be a good person because your descendants are going to look up to you as an ancestor. So you don't want a horse thief, or you don't want a crook in the family, because it shames not just you and your family and clan and the entire country, but it shames your ancestors and your descendants. According to Confucianism, China is called the Middle Kingdom. If you look at the map on the right up, see at the very center, there's a little yellow dot. That is Peking, or Beijing, as we call it today. That is the center of the earth. Well, around Beijing are the Han Chinese. These are the ethnic Chinese who make up 90% of the population of China. Well, also included in that circle are even the Chinese in Hong Kong, Taiwan, who are, Taiwan is only loosely associated with China, but they are still Han Chinese. The next circle are overseas Chinese. These are the Chinese in Flushing, Queens, in Singapore, the Chinese of South Africa, and the growing community of Chinese in places like Brazil and Argentina. They are Chinese. They're considered part of the Chinese world. Well, in China, there are certain people who are not ethnic Chinese. These would be the people in Tibet, Mongolia, Xinjiang province, who have different languages, different cultures, even different religions, but they are still part of China and have absorbed the Confucian mentality, the sensibilities of the Chinese. Then there are independent countries who have traditionally looked to China for guidance and culture. This would be Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, Nepal, Malaysia, Indonesia. These were countries on the borders of China, but are strongly influenced by Confucianism. Korea, Japan, Vietnam, very strongly influenced by the Chinese alphabet. They all celebrate the Chinese New Year as part of their culture. So they are partially Chinese. Then you have other Asians. These are people of India and the people of Siberia, the people of the Middle East. These have a little influence of China, but still not Chinese. Then you have barbarians. This is the outer circle. These would be the people of Europe who had very little contact with China, people of Africa who had almost no contact with China until recently, Latin Americans, the United States, Canada. We are the barbarians who have not yet been exposed to Chinese culture. But there's still hope for us. We can still learn Chinese. We can still study the writings of Confucius and his followers. And we can, in a way, become influenced by the superior civilization of the Chinese. China doesn't call itself a nation state. It calls itself more of a civilization. Now, there are many civilizations in the world. For example, if you look at the map, you see this is Islamic civilization, where they have similar religion. They're influenced by Arabic language. Even if they speak another language as their first language, Arabic is still part of their religion. They still greet people with words like salam. They still don't eat pork, even if they don't go to mosques anymore, but still eating pork is considered something bad. And this is a civilization state, divided up into many little countries, but it is a civilization state. Western Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia is another civilization state. We speak the same language. We have very similar culture, very similar attitude towards women, towards holidays. Other civilizations would be the Hindu civilization. Even Hindus, Indians who live in the United States or England are still very much influenced by their Hindu civilization. Now, what's important about a civilization state like China is you can join, you can study Chinese literature, you can live in China, you can eat Chinese food, celebrate Chinese holidays, you can study Confucianism, and you can absorb many of the teachings and the qualities of the Chinese civilization. So it is not a country, it is a civilization, and people can be influenced by it and learn from it, and in a way become part of the Chinese civilization, just like you can become part of the Islamic civilization or the Western European civilization. Throughout its history, China has influenced its neighbors, whether they were Korea or Japan, Thailand, Vietnam, into Central Asia, and up into Siberia. These countries have been strongly influenced by China. And when a new emperor was proclaimed or a new king was proclaimed in Thailand or Vietnam or Japan or Korea, it was a tradition to send tribute, send gifts to the great emperor of China, as if to recognize that he is your superior. And these countries have been exposed to Chinese culture. They celebrate the Chinese New Year. They use the Chinese calendar. They venerate Confucius. And many of their languages have been strongly influenced by China. and by the emperor. So China has traditionally exerted a very powerful influence on its neighbors. Now, Chinese recent history has been rather complex. China is traditionally the most populous country in the world, the largest country in the world in many ways, and gave us gifts such as printing of books, gunpowder, Chinese art, porcelain. In fact, my mother has a china cabinet in her dining room. We call it a china closet because that's where we kept the porcelain, the good plates and cups and dishes that we used on special holidays. It was called a china closet because the Chinese made great porcelain that the Europeans could not equal. The Chinese writing system is hieroglyphics. It's a very complex system, and it is the oldest written language still in existence until today. Chinese claim that theirs is the oldest culture on the face of the earth, with art, music, writing going back thousands of years, long before there were Muslims or Christians or Jews or Hindus. Chinese view themselves as the most ancient culture on the face of the earth. Well, China has influenced its neighbors. Zheng He, the great captain of ships in 1300s and early 1400s, sailed from China the whole way to Africa, to the Middle East, visiting countries. And you see his ship in the picture. The little tiny ship in front was the ship of Christopher Columbus. That's what Europeans were building back in those years, when China was building these giant ships which could sail the oceans. When they went to Africa, Zheng He took back a herd of elephants and giraffes for the emperor's zoo back in Beijing. I mean, you couldn't get one elephant on Christopher Columbus's ship because it would probably sink the thing. So the Chinese are very proud of their history. Here we see the map of Zheng He's voyages, the whole way to Mecca and Medina, to Persia, to India, down into Mogadishu in Somalia and Mombasa, down to Indonesia, Malaysia. Some people even say that he sailed down the coast of Africa and into the Atlantic Ocean. We don't have any evidence of that, but some people claim that that's what he did. Well, the golden age of China gradually began to decline with the rise of Europe. The century of humiliation, as the Chinese call it, dated from 1842 to 1945. During these years and before, the Europeans were taking over the world. Russia was expanding, taking over huge parts of China in the north, what we call Siberia today, taking over Central Asia, which was an area of Chinese influence historically. Great Britain took over North America, big third of Africa, India, Pakistan, Australia, Malaysia. The French took over half of Africa, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Madagascar. The Americans expanded across the Pacific, taking over Philippines, Hawaii, Alaska, building its colonial empire. Well, of course, the Europeans had their eye on China. The English took over India. The French took over Vietnam. English took over Hong Kong. And their dream was to carve up China into colonies for the Europeans. 1842 was one of the great wars against China, but China was able to resist. It gave up chunks. For example, the Russians took big chunks in the north. The English took Hong Kong. The Portuguese took Macau. And the French tried to expand northward from Vietnam and take over. But the Chinese were still strong enough to resist an occupation by the Europeans. In the north, the Russians, the English tried to expand into Tibet. The French were going up from Vietnam and French into China. The English took Hong Kong. The Germans took a big chunk. The Japanese started taking over parts. But still, China was able to remain independent and resist having their country chopped up into European and Japanese colonies. In fact, in the middle of Beijing is the famous monument to the people's heroes. All of the soldiers and the intellectuals and government officials who were able to resist European domination and have their country chopped up into bits and pieces. Well, the United States had its eyes on China, but the Chinese resisted. In the United States, a lot of Chinese were brought over in the mid-1800s to build the railroads from California across the country. Well, tens of thousands of young Chinese guys came over, building the railroads. Well, the Chinese were hardworking. They opened up stores, they opened up laundries and restaurants, and they stuck to their Chinese culture. They were not going to become Catholics or Protestants. They kept their traditions, their food, they celebrated their holidays, they venerated Confucius, they went to Buddhist temples. Well, the United States in 1882 decided that it was time to get rid of the Chinese. This is a central element in the century of humiliation in the eyes of the Chinese, that the Americans were racists and they didn't want Chinese. America was a white country. It had slavery in the South and segregation in the North of African Americans, a long history of anti-Semitism. And so the Chinese were being persecuted in the United States. So not only in China were the Europeans and Americans trying to grab big chunks of the country, but even in the United States, vicious anti-Chinese sentiment. In fact, in the year 1900, the United States invaded China. We conquered Peking. We looted the city. Entire railroad cars were filled with art, gold, manuscripts, porcelain, statues of the Buddha, and everything shipped back to the United States and sold off to museums. People became millionaires by everything that they stole from China. China still wants all this artwork back, but the United States, hell no, we stole it fair and square. We looted China. Very important date in the century of humiliation. In fact, not too long ago, there was a big article in the New York Times where Chinese agents were going through the museums, finding out what happened to everything that the Americans, as well as the Europeans, stole from China. They want it back. So there's still a lot of hard feeling between the Chinese and the Americans, and the Chinese and the Europeans. The Japanese got into the act of looting China. They took over Korea, expanded up into Manchuria, northern China in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And then in World War II, the great massacre of Nanking, where tens of thousands of people, Chinese, were murdered by the Japanese army. And the Japanese took over almost everything they wanted in Asia. Another horrendous act of humiliation, which the Chinese will never forget. Well, the century of humiliation came to an end following World War II. Mao Zedong became the ruler of China. Well, it was a bloody civil war where the United States opposed him, the Europeans opposed him, but he was able to take over the country. On the right, we see the picture that we all know of him, but we tend to forget that he was once a young man and a very serious intellectual, political leader, military leader. So following World War II, Mao Zedong took over and ended the century of humiliation. Well, it was a major effort to get rid of all of the foreign influence. The Europeans and the Americans were not happy to see a strong China emerging. The United States tried to control China. We built military bases in Japan, the Philippines, Australia, Taiwan, war to take over South Korea, American war to dominate Vietnam, American war to take over Afghanistan. All of these countries which Chinese had always considered their sphere of influence. So even though Mao Zedong had gotten Chinese independence, still the United States was doing everything it could to keep China down. Well, under Mao Zedong, China was reclaiming its past glory. The posters that you see like this one showing the soldiers, the intellectuals, the workers, men and women building factories, building bridges, building highways, building housing for the people. China was once again on the march. The Cultural Revolution, disaster in many ways, but it was a revolution to get rid of foreign influence, get rid of Christian missionaries, get rid of American and European influence, throw out foreigners, make China great again. Well, China is now well on its way to dominating the 21st century. In fact, many people say that the future of the planet is going to be Chinese. Well, in 4 areas, China is rebuilding the world in its own image: economic, military, cultural, and political. In these 4 areas, China is taking over the world. Economic. Look at the industrial production of the different countries from 2007 to 2013. At the very bottom, you see the European Community, the United States, Japan. But look at China. Huge industrial production, building cars, building clothing, steel mills, using energy, electric energy, coal, gasoline. China is becoming the largest industrial economy on the face of the earth. In fact, when you look around, probably your computer is made in China. Probably your phones, your printer is made in China. A lot of your clothing and shoes are made in China. So China is becoming the number one economic power in the world. Chinese companies like Alibaba is under Jack Ma is becoming one of the most powerful businesses on the face of the earth. Last I checked, it was approaching $22 billion in just a investment by other countries. Alibaba is bigger than Facebook, bigger than General Motors, bigger than IBM, one of the largest companies in the world. And China is building a network of highways, railroads, shipping lines to link China with the rest of the world. It's now cheaper to ship something by railroad from China to Germany than it is to go by sea. China is building railroads in Africa to bring out the resources of Africa and ship them to China. Highways and railroads to sell Chinese goods to the rest of the world. This is called the Silk Road. And you see the red lines linking the entire world with China. China 2025, make China great again. And this is under the powerful leader of President Xi Jinping. Once again, he is in charge. Now remember, this is a Confucianist mentality. He is at the top. If he decides that a giant bridge is going to be built somewhere, or a brand new city is going to be built somewhere, it is built. And it is built efficiently and quickly. When I was in Xi'an, I met a person who was surprised and impressed that I was a university professor and taught history. And he offered me a job. He said, we have the University of Xi'an. And I wasn't interested in staying in Xi'an and working there, but I went along with him. I said, well, yeah, I'd like to visit the campus. So we went out into the countryside, and it was a desert going for miles. And he said, this is where the campus is going to be. Well, I was there in April, and he said you could start teaching in September. And I looked and I said, but there's nothing here. And he said, oh, he said, you forgot, this is China. President Xi ordered us to build a university. This week, thousands of workers, cement mixers, railroad cars filled with steel are going to arrive, and we are going to build a university for 50,000 students in 2 months. And I said, my God, if I would start teaching, the paint wouldn't even be dry in my apartment or classroom. And he said, oh, this is China. When the president decides that something is going to happen, it happens. Doesn't get bogged down in politics in Washington and everybody protesting. When he decides that something will be accomplished, it will be accomplished. And so this is, again, this Confucianist mentality. Now, of course, if you don't like what he's doing and he wants to take your house and demolish it to build a campus, you might not be very happy. But then again, it's his job to build an apartment block for all the people who are displaced and to make sure they have a job. So that is the duty of the president. He is building heaven on earth. He's not sitting around waiting to die and then to have all the pepperoni pizza and beer that he wants up in heaven. He wants his pepperoni pizza and Budweiser beer here on earth. The Chinese have established the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, where Brazil, Canada, Australia, most of the countries of Europe and the Middle East are now joining with the Chinese. And in this investment bank, Brazil needs a railroad across the country. It appeals to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The Chinese finance it. They send over the engineers. They build it. And it is good for Chinese business, and it's good for Brazil. So this is another way that China is building its world influence. Of course, the red countries, Japan and the United States, do not want to have anything to do with this bank because it is making China too strong, and the United States is fearful. China is expanding into Central Asia. The areas like Kazakhstan, which were formerly part of the Soviet Union, are now independent countries. And China has the money, the technology, building factories, building railroads, highways, entire new cities in these Central Asian republics. This has been the traditional area of Chinese influence. In fact, many people argue that China is going to take over Siberia, huge area of Siberia in Russia with very little population. In fact, many of the cities in Siberia today have more Chinese immigrants than they do Russian. Well, at the moment, China and Russia are getting along pretty well. And so it doesn't look like China is going to take over Siberia, but it's businessmen, farmers are moving in, and it is being developed. But whether China is actually going to take it over or not, that's something we'll have to see in the future. Another way that China is growing in power is by sending migrants and immigrants to other countries where they get citizenship, settle, and they start taking over very important sectors of the economy. For example, South Africa, 350,000 Chinese, probably much more today and ever growing, whereas the Chinese government sends young Chinese to settle in South Africa, become citizens, to take over the diamond and the gold industry in South Africa. In Mexico, they're taking over all the big hotels and bringing over millions of Chinese tourists. In Thailand, 10 million Chinese have settled. Malaysia, 4 million in the United States. Well, when you go to Flushing, Queens, or to the many Chinatowns, you see all these Chinese. Well, they are, in many ways, taking over the American economy. Go to the Peter Stuyvesant High School in New York. 80 or 90% of the students are Asians. They have affirmative action for white people and Jews and African Americans and Hispanics who are too lazy to study and take the test to get into Stuyvesant High School. But the Chinese, since they realize that if you're going to have heaven, you're going to build it here on earth. So they educate their kids, they work hard, they go to the public school all day, then they go to the Chinese school all weekend, and they cram courses, take the exams into the best schools in the United States, and they dominate. In fact, at Harvard, where I graduated, everybody's saying if they just accepted students on their intelligence and education, Harvard would be an entirely Chinese university. So immigration, sending Chinese settlers into all kinds of countries to take over crucial businesses, is part of the Chinese strategy to become the world superpower. In the United States, Chinese are rapidly becoming the largest immigrant group, overtaking Mexicans and Dominicans, which have traditionally been the largest groups. But the Chinese are rapidly and possibly already are the largest minority group in New York and eventually in the United States. The Chinese economy is growing. See the report, when will China's economy overtake the USA? It is generally believed it is happening in the year 2019, but COVID intervened and threw everything up in the air. But the United States economy is shrinking. American global influence is shrinking economically, and China is well on its way to taking over the world economy. Well, the second way that China is becoming the world superpower is militarily. The Chinese country is completely surrounded by American military bases. Americans have literally a wall around China, going from Japan and South Korea down through the Philippines. In fact, as I'm speaking, just yesterday, the Philippines opened up another 4 or 5 American military bases, Malaysia, Singapore, Australia. So the United States goal has been to contain China. Well, the Chinese are struggling to get through this American military wall. Today, they have the largest navy in the world. They have the largest army in the world. And they are developing atomic bombs, space warfare, to try to break through the American encirclement. And the dangers of a war, especially over Taiwan, which is part of China, but as separate and is supported by the United States. So there is a danger of a war as China gets militarily more and more powerful. And don't forget, these military bases are in the United States are far from the United States. They're over in Asia. Whereas for the Chinese, they are on China's doorstep. Very important area for control is going to be the Middle East. Today, the Chinese are the biggest customer for oil from the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Kuwait, these other countries in the Middle East, United Arab Emirates, most of their exported oil now goes to China. So Saudi Arabia and these countries of the Middle East have more economic ties to China than they do to the United States. The United States still has military bases all over the Middle East, from Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Iraq, still under American occupation. So the United States still has military bases there, but countries like Saudi Arabia and Iraq are starting to say, well, maybe we should get rid of the Americans and maybe the Chinese can be our protector. And the Chinese are starting to build military bases beyond China for the very first time. China is building its own battleships. It is building its own space satellites. And many people say that these satellites that China is putting up are militarily dangerous. They can shoot a laser beam and destroy another satellite. So the wars of the future are not going to be just on the seas and on the land and in the air, but it's going to be in space as well. China is grabbing islands in what they call the Chinese tongue, the dark blue area there, building military bases off the coast of Vietnam, the Philippines, and claiming that entire area as the South China Sea. So it is expanding its territory, both on land, the islands, and in space. The third way China is expanding its global influence is through a network of Confucius institutes. These are university-based educational centers in Africa, especially Europe, in North America and South America, where they are exporting Chinese culture. At NYU, they have a very large Confucius Center. The United States is getting rather critical of them because they are too successful in attracting young, highly educated people to go to China, experience China, maybe even live there and participate in the rise of China. Binghamton University, Confucius Institute, for introducing Chinese opera, Chinese dance, Chinese language courses, workshops for teachers of Chinese to expose Americans to Chinese culture. Summer programs for kids where they learn Chinese, learn how to cook Chinese food. You see them very often in South America. This is at the University of Yaoundé in Cameroon, where I lived for a while. And there you see Africans learning Chinese dance, Chinese languages. And for the best students, the Chinese give them a scholarship to study for a couple of years or even do an academic program in China. So educational and cultural influence is part of the growing power of China. Scholarships to people in Asia, South Korea, Thailand, Pakistan, India, 21,000 from the United States, large numbers of Russians going to China. And China is recruiting the best and the brightest, offering them a stipend for housing, insurance, spending money, giving them scholarships to go and to study in China. And a lot of young people do that. I was surprised at how many people I met when I was traveling around China who had come to China on scholarships, learn the language, taking classes, and especially in the areas of science and technology. And of course, Europeans and Americans are not thrilled with that, saying the Chinese are kidnapping the best and the brightest. Well, if you're offered a full scholarship with housing, insurance, and everything else to do a doctoral program in physics in China, well, that is a very tempting offer. The fourth way that China is expanding its influence is through political influence. Most of the organizations in the world, the global organizations, international organizations, were established by the United States following World War II. United Nations, for example, headquarters is in New York. The United States funds many programs at the United Nations, and it gives the United States and Western Europe a great amount of influence. The United States also established organizations like SEATO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which brought Thailand, the Philippines, Australia, and Pakistan into a military organization to oppose communism and also to oppose the rising power of China. All these organizations, UN Human Rights, International Monetary Fund, UNESCO, the World Bank, these were all established, and most of them are still controlled by the United States and Western Europe. And China has very limited influence in these, which causes a lot of problems for China. But the Chinese are starting to demand more and more of a presence in these international organizations. For example, in some organizations, Chinese have become the major contributor. See the graph on the left when you see which countries are contributing the most to international organizations today. China is by far the largest. The United States is becoming a minor contributor. But yet Europe, combined with the United States, still constitute the most powerful economic factor in the UN. But China, of course, when it contributes money, it demands a say in meetings. It demands that Chinese or its supporters be appointed to high positions in things like the World Health Organization, Food and Agriculture, International Telecommunications Union, Development Fund. So China realizes that all these international organizations were established by the United States after World War II, but they are more and more demanding a major Chinese presence, saying we are now the number one or possibly the number two economic power. We are the number one or number two military power in the world. And so we deserve more influence in these international organizations. So what kind of superpower is China going to be? This is the big question. Well, when we look at how other countries have exerted their power and have grown powerful, we can compare these countries with China. How did the United States take over North America? The genocide of the American Indians, reservations, poison, killing them. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. So is China going to be a brutal world power? Look at what the Spanish did in South America, Central America, destroying religions, destroying cultures. In fact, many people say half of the population of the Americas died from European diseases. And the Spanish turned the survivors into virtual slaves. How did Great Britain deal with its colonies in Asia, in Africa? Well, exploited them, massacred hundreds of thousands of Africans and Indians to maintain their power. The French in Algeria were as brutal as anybody else. How did the Germans, when they tried to take over Europe, how did they treat the Jews? How did they treat the Poles and the Russians? The United States, with its history of racism against the African Americans, slavery and Jim Crow laws, ghettos. The Israelis taking over Palestine, rounding up millions of Palestinians, dumping them in glorified prisons such as the Gaza Strip and the West Bank settlements. So when a country gets power, the question is, how do they use that power? Well, how is China going to use its power? Well, China, because of its Confucianist background, views itself as the ideal society, well-run, efficient, strong authoritarian leaders at the top. China has very little concern for individual rights. Religious minorities are persecuted, such as the Uyghur Muslims, clamp down on democracy and freedoms in Hong Kong and in China itself. China is an authoritarian state, but then on the other hand, it has brought more people out of poverty than any other country in human history. Hundreds of millions of people brought in a few number of years from poverty to middle class status. So this is the Chinese model. And many countries, when they look at Chinese model, they say African countries should copy it. Have a good, strong, authoritarian leader. Don't worry too much about individual human rights. Don't worry too much about religious freedoms and democratic freedoms, but get a good, strong leader who will organize the country and do what is necessary to bring them into the industrial age. And when you compare what's going on in Washington today with Republicans battling the Democrats and the government is almost paralyzed, whereas China under Prime Minister Xi, President Xi, is dragging China into the future. So many people find that the Chinese model is the model to be copied. Of course, there are problems. There are demonstrations by Muslims demanding their religious freedom. Many Christians are finding themselves in problems with the government. Tibet, the Muslim areas are not at all happy with the situation. So there are a lot of issues, issues with women, with gays and lesbians. Individual freedoms are being restricted. But then again, the Chinese would say it is for the greater good. But nobody can argue that the Chinese miracle, the Chinese model has been successful. It has taken more people from abject poverty and starvation and brought them into middle-class status than any country in the future. Remember when I was a kid, my mother would always say, eat your peas, think of the poor starving children in China. Well, in China, they say, eat your peas, think of the poor starving children in New York City. So many people admire the China miracle and seek to imitate it. So as we look into the future, one elephant in the room, maybe the biggest elephant in the room, is the rise of China, something that is inevitable and that we have to deal with. But it's not the only factor which is going to be shaping the future. Globalization. China is major consumer and producer of goods around the world. And oil flows freely around the world. Money flows around the world. migrants flow around the world, ideas flow around the world. This is the globalization. Thomas Friedman said the world is flat. Another factor determining the future is the rise of religious movements. We just had the re-election of Netanyahu in Israel. Well, his major supporters are the religious radicals, and they argue for the complete suppression of the Muslims, even mass expulsion, West Bank settlements, ethnic cleansing in Iran. Can't understand the Middle East without the rise of Islam. Can't understand Donald Trump without understanding the rise of the evangelical Christians. Brazil, Mexico, evangelical Christians control the government. So religion is a major factor, and it is shaping the future. Samuel P. Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations, predicts that the great civilizations, such as the Chinese civilization, Islamic civilization, Western Christian civilization, Hindu civilization, are going to clash. And the 21st century is going to be a century of bloody warfare between civilizations. And so there are a lot of visions of the future, and we're trying to discuss some of them in lectures like this one. But once again, the biggest elephant in the room in the eyes of many people is the rise of China. So, thank you very much for joining me today in this fascinating lecture. Fasten your seatbelts, because the 21st century is going to be a pretty wild ride. It's exciting. Students often ask me, as a historian, if you had to choose any time to be alive, when would you want to be alive? And I always say, today, because we don't know how it's going to end up. Every other period, we know what happened. We know what happened in World War I, World War II, Napoleon, the Renaissance, the age of Greece and Rome. We know how they ended. But today, we don't know. So we have to keep our eyes open to find out what is going on in the world today. So this is Dr. Ronald J. Brown signing off. Thank you for joining me, and have a good day. Bye-bye.